and then unmute you, Kristen. I'll get you to, you might have to unmute yourself. There you go. Hello, Kristen, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, thanks for joining us. David, please take it away with the first paper.
Yes, thanks a lot. And Kyle is online also, so I think you can also unmute him. Thanks to both of you, and maybe there are further co-authors on the call, but thanks, Kristen, for answering our query and being there today. And the introduction song was a perfect choice, because we are indeed flying away with your paper. So you work with Kyle Elliott at McGill University. It's a collaboration with Colgate University and the Institute for Seabird Research and Conservation in Anchorage. And in our little seabird world, we focus a lot on diving, to the point that we sometimes forget that they are also incredible flying machines. Although flight mechanics have been studied extensively in land birds, famously in the context of bird evolution and of feathered dinosaurs, few seabird papers address flight mechanics, actually. This may change now, because data loggers recording 3D accelerometry provide us with information on each single wing beat. But can biologging inform us about flight muscle characteristics as an additional fitness proxy? This is the question Kristen and her colleagues asked by gathering parallel information on muscle ultrastructure and 3D acceleration in Kittiwakes from Middleton Island in Alaska. We already talked about Middleton in a previous Seabird session. That's this weird, slightly unstable seabird island where Scott Hatch and his collaborators study many aspects of seabird ecology, notably in Kittiwakes, which breed in a disused radar tower. The setup provides them with unique opportunities, nearly as in a lab environment. In this study, they equipped breeding Kittiwakes with 9-gram GPS and 3D accelerometers. And from these birds, they also took small biopsies from flight muscles. They thoroughly tested that the whole procedure did not impact the birds, and they analyzed accelerometry data so as to extract wing beat frequencies and flight speeds. And from the biopsies, they studied muscle ultrastructure under a microscope. Specifically, they determined muscle fiber diameter and the number of nuclei per muscle fiber. This latter measurement is an index of muscle power. If there are more nuclei, muscle fibers are stronger, promoting powered flight. By linking the two data sets, Kristen and her colleagues found that heavier Kittiwakes had higher wing beat frequencies relative to lighter individuals. This, of course, was to be expected, because heavier Kittiwakes much work harder to maintain flight. But interestingly, they also found that wing beat frequency was lower for individuals with larger muscle fiber diameters after accounting for body mass. This points to stronger, more efficient flight in these birds with larger muscle fibers. Also, birds with more nuclei per muscle fiber reached higher flight speeds, indicating that they were also more powerful flyers. It's only a glance through the paper, and there are many more interesting facts in the study, which I will not detail here. One really fascinating discussion point, though, was about the optimal size for muscle fibers. Large muscle fibers have higher energy efficiency because of a better surface to volume ratio, but at the same time, oxygen and ATP diffuse better across smaller muscle fibers. Overall, the study shows that we can extract information on flight muscle from accelerometry data indeed. And this information is key because it provides an additional fitness metric to assess bird health, a metric which can be determined in very short term and is more efficient than longer term conventional fitness metrics such as survival or lifetime reproductive success. And this approach is coherent with the idea of an energetic fitness in wild animals, a research avenue which I think has a great potential. So congratulations on this study, Kristen, which I read with a lot of interest. It was very well done. maybe there was one point I was unsure about, because at some stage in the text you mentioned Hill's equation, and I wondered whether you could specify exactly what you meant by this.
Yeah, sure. So Hill's equation in context to muscle describes the force, the relationship between force and the velocity of contraction. So if a bird has a higher load, the speed of its muscle contractions will actually be lower. And so in the paper, we said the optimal frequency should be constant. So I guess that relates a bit more to energetics. So there's probably an optimal speed where the muscle is operating.
No, that's very interesting, and of course this will vary with overall bird mass, and this idea that you stress also in the paper, that there's a lower flight limit, as in an aeroplane they cannot undergo, otherwise they just plummet from the air. So overall, do you think that in future studies, it won't be necessary anymore to take biopsies, because all the information you'll need will be available from accelerometry recordings?
I guess that's the ideal goal. So there's probably a bit more work that needs to be done examining flight and muscle ultrastructure, which is being worked on by another one of my lab mates actually on MERS. But ideally, yes, the end goal would be that people wouldn't have to do these invasive procedures and they could just use accelerometry to get at these things.
Yeah. I was wondering also about the volume of the biopsy, because my only experience with a biopsy was about 10 years ago. I think it was in a king penguin. And I witnessed this just before breakfast, and I think I nearly fainted as I saw actually how much of the muscle they were taking. So I was wondering, in your case, how the biopsy volume was relative to the overall flight muscle volume.
Yeah, so we used a 6mm biopsy punch, so relative to a Kittiwakes muscle. Kittiwakes about 400 grams, so it's pretty small relative to the overall muscle size.
And I can hop in there and tell you exactly that a few years ago, I did the messy business of trying to dissect a kittiwake muscle and digesting it in pepine. And it's a terrible thing that you definitely don't want to do before breakfast. But kittiwake muscle on average is about 48 grams. And so we were taking less than half a gram. So it's less than 1%.
Yes, and well, you explained very well also, and you tested in the study that the whole procedure didn't seem to have an impact on a range of characteristics about the birds. But in terms of trying to get non-invasive measurements about bird body condition, I know that quite a while ago people were trying to look at impedance measurement as a proxy for lean body mass. I wonder whether this is something you explored in the Kittiwakes, for instance.
Yeah, so we didn't actually do that for our project. We didn't have the equipment for that, but I think it could be interesting to be able to look at fat and lean body mass to get kind of an idea of whether those are related to flight. And so maybe the muscle mass does have some relationship with these muscle parameters that we wouldn't have been able to figure out with our study.
Yes, and I forgot to mention also that there was a sister study to the one you published 1 or 2 years ago. I think this was led by Brown, which tested whether the age of a Kittiwakes had any incidence on flight muscle ultrastructure, and there was none, pointing again to the amazing fact that for many instances there are no sign of muscular aging in these creatures. This I found also really interesting. But maybe a last question before I turn to my colleagues on Seabird Session and the audience. There was one point maybe you didn't develop completely in the discussion. You found that there was lower wing beat frequency when the birds were flying farther. Do you interpret this as a way by the bird to anticipate the fact that they'll be flying for a longer time?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it's more of a behavioral adjustment than anything else. So maybe if the bird's flying further, it's flying a bit slower because it's searching for food, or just because it wants to save some energy.
Okay, but that would mean that they do have some slack, or there's some adjustment potential with respect to wing beats, which I find surprising, because I had this perception that this would be very fine tuned when you have such a high wing loading as in. Oh, sorry, no, we're talking about Kittiwakes, and I was in MERS. So no, that's right. In Kittiwakes, you do have some slack. So maybe the prediction would be that in MERS, you wouldn't have this sort of adjustment.
Yeah, I guess in Kittiwakes you might, but in MERS, maybe the future paper will kind of get at that a bit more.
Yeah, we've collected the same set of data for MERS, and so it'll be really interesting to see with them, where they really don't have as much they can do in terms of adjusting wing beat frequency. They only really have one speed, and that's as fast as possible. So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's what I had in mind with this. Far less potential for adjustment. Grant or Marianna, do you have questions about that paper?
Marianna, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Hello, Kristen. Hello, Kyle.
nice to see
so
you.
Yes, nice to see you too. Some of the questions you touched already with the video. I was also interested in the comparison with the thick build more. So, but yes, it is coming. So I will patiently wait. Yes, and I was interested about your point in your discussion about the heat stress and the response that you would see for the heat stress. So yeah, I was wondering if you would see then changes in the muscle fiber, in the fiber diameter, and so also in the wing beat frequency in heat stress conditions or not, if you would expect something like that.
Yeah, I think we might. So there have been studies done like on house sparrows, and that wasn't done with respect to tracking, like there was no accelerometry done, but they did have some changes in their muscles. So that would probably lead to changes in their flight. And so maybe they wouldn't be as efficient foragers, for example.
We definitely see that even in MERS.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, in MERS, sometimes they're coming back to the cliffs and they're just panting and panting and panting and just clearly overheated. Yeah. And so I would imagine that they're certainly adjusting their power output in that case to try and minimize the heat stress.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Grant?
Any other questions? Okay. All right. So I've my two questions, I guess. The first one is about how you account for environmental variability in flight. I mean, obviously, when birds are faced with a strong headwind, they're going to flap more or less, I guess, depending on how they use the winds. So how do you account for, or how can you account for that in this sort of work? Is there, or is that the reason why you've got a fair amount of variability around your trend lines in these cases?
Yeah, so we actually used weather data from NOAA. So to calculate airspeed, we kind of calculate the vector of which direction the kittiwake was going and then which direction the wind was going. So we use that to calculate airspeed. And of course that isn't perfect because it's the wind data are on bigger scales and the kittiwakes are fine. But we use that to kind of account for that.
Okay. Yeah. Do you reckon that that these sort of patterns then would translate to other species, like the gliding species, the shearwaters? And I mean, shearwaters hardly ever beat a wing at all. So would you expect to see a relationship like that in those sorts of species, especially albatross? I mean, albatross have huge flight muscles, but barely use them.
Yeah, I guess that would be really interesting to look at. I guess maybe if they're flying with the wind, maybe they're just not flapping at all. And so there might be different components to it than just the kittiwakes that have pretty much constant flapping flight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I sort of consider kittiwakes like what I would say a normal flyer. They kind of flap their wings, and as a lot of birds tend to, whereas you get like murres and puffins that are flapping like there's no tomorrow, and then the complete opposite, of course, the albatross. And presumably these relationships would change depending on the wing loading. So yeah, it'd be really interesting. I'm quite keen to see that murre paper come out. Joanna, you look like you had a question. I saw your finger go up there. Let me unmute yourself there.
I can't find that little thing that usually lets me put the hand up. But anyway, my hand works perfectly well. I found this really, really very interesting. So I want to ask a question. If you think about things like terns, which most people are less inclined to think of as seabirds in the same sense, but nonetheless, if you think about them, they are doing a lot of short flights in the breeding season just to find food. They're going on the order of 2 to 10 miles. They're not going a long ways, but then they migrate all the way to, the southern, sometimes partway down South America. And then if you think of things like a knot, which we've put geolocators on, and so we know exactly what they're doing and when they're flying and when they're not. And they will fly for 6 days straight, nonstop, not stopping anywhere, which of course terns are not doing. They stop in the ocean and they feed and they do this or they do that. But the red knots are flying 5 to 7 days straight. We had one individual that actually flew over the Andes. I mean, they didn't even take a good route. And so the question is, is your technique going to be useful in any way to look at these species, which seemingly, when you're red knot, you're talking about when it leaves, it probably weighs, its fat-free weight is like 110 or 120 grams. And when it starts off to fly on these long flights, it might weigh 180 grams. But still, it's kind of amazing that a bird that weighs 180 grams can fly for 6 days without stopping. So I've always wondered whether they were going into some muscular overdrive that we don't know about. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, I did read a paper that basically says that, I guess, birds they make some of their organs smaller and some of their organs bigger when they're preparing for migration. And so the pectoral muscle is one of those muscles that does get bigger. So I guess they are in a sense preparing.
Well, yeah, we know that, and we've been trying to actually look at the size of the even things like the gizzard ends up being incredibly lessened during the flight. But I'm still wondering whether we can find out anything about the muscles to the degree that you've been looking at in something like that, or the technology won't allow it.
Yeah, I guess the accelerometer might not have the battery life for maybe a full, I guess it'd have a battery life for the migration, but then maybe
how long is it?
Migration. So the ones I have, they lasted, so we did 4-day deployments and they lasted throughout the 4 days. It also depends on the sampling frequency as well. But you could probably get their migration and then you'd have to recapture the accelerometers, say, the next year. And so you might be able to look at some of the things that we did.
Thank you.
I can jump in there a little bit too and just say that, people are doing this with, obviously bigger animals, but like bar-headed geese, right? I mean, so they've been doing some of this where they're flying over the Himalayas. But I guess they're built for that. And you would imagine that certainly something like a knot or a bar-headed goose must have muscle ultrastructure, which is really finely tuned for what it has to do, and perhaps changing consistently along migration as it. I'm thinking the bar-headed goose, which is going up and down, but also just kind of as it loses mass, you would expect that the from Hill's equation that the optimum frequency would change as well. And so it's possible that we could pick that up from the accelerometer, and it could tell us a little bit about how the muscle ultrastructure might be changing all the way through the migration.
How much does it weigh?
Well, the ones we were using were 9 grams. TechnoSmart have ones, but they don't last very long, but go down to 1.8 grams. And the ones they were putting on the bar-headed geese were, I don't know, I think about 20 grams.
Yeah, see, when we put geolocators on, they have to be really under 2 grams in terms of, worrying about weight. So it's a problem in these smaller birds, but maybe we'll get there. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Do you have any? Is there anybody else in the audience who has any questions at the moment? Nobody frantically waving their arms at the screen and no hands raised. Is there any spatial applications here that could be explored? I mean, could you look at, whether or not you track wing loading in space and then model that somehow and look at areas that are, I don't know, more prone to birds flapping a lot or something along those lines? I'm just kind of voicing ideas at the moment, but just I was just thinking about that randomly as Joe was talking.
Well,
Yeah.
I think there's. Go ahead, Kristen.
Oh, sorry, Kyle. Yeah, you could look at, I guess, wing beat frequency and airspeed, and with that, you could probably identify areas of foraging, as opposed to just areas where they're doing faster commuting flights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential to look kind of year round. I mean, if we did have accelerometers that we could put on year round to look at body mass and muscle size and structure and how that changes year round as well, and to kind of map out perhaps hot spots and areas where they're not doing so well as well.
Yeah, you can imagine that would be interesting for looking at foraging or looking at foraging aggregations and the like. David, do you have any more questions?
No, I was trying to remember what the people working on waders did in terms of flight muscle measurements, but I can't. I wonder whether anyone in the audience remember whether in these really long range migrating waders there were some measurements specifically on the flight muscle. I know that people tested a lot of things about anatomical plasticity, in terms of a reduction of digestive tract and of course use of body reserves. But I can't remember specifically whether something was done on the flight muscles. I think they also shrink to a certain extent towards the end of the flight. I wonder whether these really long range flyers, whether they do have ultimately muscle damages.
Yeah, I think Piersma did some work there on bar-tailed godwit, both showing that there was some muscle damage happening on these really long flights, and also that there was some changes in the muscle ultrastructure. I can't remember. I mean, certainly the fibers, I think they were relatively larger, but the overall lean muscle mass was also kind of larger during the migration, if I recall.
So there's a lot that needs to be done with that, because at least in the knot system, there are short distance, intermediate distance, and long distance migrants, and the ones that are coming from Tierra del Fuego, that's one of the things we're trying to look at, actually, if they have more loss of internal organs and different places, using sonogram kinds of things that you can that you can put over the body and get the size without injuring the bird and leaving the bird to go. But they actually have, the longer distance migrants have less time to build back up. So the longer distance migrants presumably have to repair more of the internal organs and the digestive tract and the muscles, because they, for example, Delaware Bay only spend a week there, whereas the short distance migrants are there for 2 or 3 weeks. So there's a lot of things, it seems like we have to put together the whole kind of picture.
Yeah. And I probably forgot to mention that another alternative technique to work on these things, well, when you have a bird in hand, is ecography. You can do ecography of the flight muscles to get flight muscle thickness. And,
yeah, that's what we've been doing.
In Dovecki's, we found that this works quite well, but we haven't related it yet to the accelerometry recordings we had, but that's an idea, I guess.
Cool. All right.
If anyone has one of those units they're willing to lend to us, we'd love to use that as well. I looked into the cost, and they wanted $60,000 US for one of these, so I passed.
Yeah.
One of the things that we did, if you're actually looking for one, is if you go make friends with your local vet, sometimes they have those things, and we actually got one from a local vet who was going out of business, so to speak, and he sort of gave it to us. So, vets are a potential source of them locally.
There you go.
I'll look into that.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome to borrow ours, Kyle. But that means a trip to France to fetch it. I'm not sending it.
Yeah.
But will be very nice to see you in Chizé.
And drink wine, of course.
Yeah, especially this time of year.
Yeah, especially.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Thanks for that. And Kristen, thanks for joining us. Thanks for that paper. David, of course, thank you for that. Kyle, nice to see you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you for the questions. Before we move on to the next paper, I want to tease you all with an upcoming event that we've just discussed. So my wonderful wife had the fantastic idea of doing an open mic night for Seabirders. I know there's a number of music lovers out there and musicians in the Seabird community. So keep your eyes open to this space. We won't be using the Zoom platform. We've been put onto a very cool platform called gather.town. For those of you who get a chance to explore it and check it out, I highly recommend it. It is a super cool platform, but it'll allow us to do quite a relaxed open mic session sometimes. So for those musicians out there, please keep that on your radar because it'll be a blast.
What's the platform again?
It's called gather.town.
Thank you.
Yeah, look it up and just put it in your browser. They have a little demo you can run. Basically, you have a little avatar that walks around the room, and you can play with it. Yeah, it's a fantastic platform, and I expect that we'll do some activities on those beyond just an open mic night. So yeah, keep your eyes open. All right. With that being said, we are going to move on to the penguin paper, which I will be discussing. I've got Alex, Noah, and Steve on here. Noah, hello, and here we go. I'm just going to get you guys to unmute yourselves. Hello, Noah. Nice to see you, Alex. Fantastic to see you, my friend. Steve, of course. Nice to see you all. It's been a while.
Hey.
It's a real shame that we're not down counting penguins this time of year, but we get to look on to other people who are down there at the moment, whose names shall not be said out of frustration. He knows who he is. Anyways, okay, we've got this very cool paper by Noah and colleagues that I will be discussing. I've got my notes here, which I need to bring up. Now, before I start, I really want to say that we're kind of excited that we've got Noah here today with us. Now, for those of you who don't know, Noah achieved some notoriety in the birding community a few years ago for nabbing just over 6,000 species in a year, which at the time was a world record. Now, he's written some really cool, compelling books on his adventures and has since decided to join the research community to work on penguins, and he is based at Stony Brook University. Now, Antarctic penguins, as we know, are amazing animals that live in one of the most extreme environments on the planet. Now, this not only makes them fascinating because they're generally free of many anthropogenic influences, but they're also very inaccessible in that, you need to run special missions to go quantify the spatial temporal changes in their populations. Now, the pygoscelid penguins, so these are gentoo, chinstrap, adeles, they all breed on land in discrete colonies in areas with no cover and on ground nests. Now, although they're inaccessible, it means that despite those challenges of getting to the colonies, there are a number of methods available for counting those birds that range from, say, manual ground counts to UAVs or even satellites in some cases. Now, chinstrap penguins, which are the focus of this paper, are an abundant species on the Antarctic Peninsula with colonies greater than 100,000 pairs in some places. And those numbers come from past census efforts. Now, despite these large colonies and the large number of colonies, a lot of them are very inaccessible because these birds nest in rugged and remote parts of the Antarctic Peninsula. So this means that tourist vessels, which are often used as platforms for penguin counters, don't visit those colonies. So this has led to a relatively large data gap in our knowledge of chinstrap penguin population dynamics, with many sites not even having been visited since the 1980s. Now, I'm going to share my screen because I've got a couple of figures up from the paper that I think would be interesting to those of you watching. Where are we? Screen 1 or 2? I can't remember which screen I'm on here. That's screen 2, so it must be screen 1. Okay, here we go. Those of you can see this. Can you see that all right?
Yep.
All right, so this is one of the figures of the paper. This just shows the distribution of chinstrap penguin colonies. You can see it's especially most of them are concentrated over here, sort of in the southwest Atlantic portion. A lot of colonies down on the Antarctic Peninsula, and we've got some around South Georgia, South Sandwich Islands, South Orkney Islands, and Elephant Island down here. And if I go up here, you can see some more, a little bit more in detail of the Antarctic Peninsula. A lot of these colonies, especially down the west coast of these islands here, are just very, very rarely visited. Elephant Island, a lot of that hasn't been surveyed since the 1970s and 80s. And so we just had a lot of data gaps that existed for this species, which is quite a shame because it is so abundant down there. Now, globally, it was estimated there were about 3 to 8 million breeding pairs of chinstrap penguins, with varying reports on the population trends. But the general consensus is that chinstrap abundance increased through into the 1970s and then declined dramatically in some cases, with the exception of colonies in South Sandwich Islands and South Georgia. Now, Noah and his colleagues aimed to plug this data gap and answer a couple of questions. The first being, how many chinstraps are there? And the second being, has the data, a new data census, changed our current understanding of population dynamics? So to do this, they leverage data from a number of different data sources. So this includes stuff in the published literature, additional unpublished data from a recent field survey, and estimates derived from high resolution satellite images. There was also some other data available from Landsat that was available. So for the data that currently existed in the public domain, they accessed data on penguinmap.com and used colony sites as defined on that web application, including they added a couple of new ones because there were a couple of colonies that were new to the project. So the new data for 2019-2020 that was added to this database were obtained via a dedicated mission facilitated by several NGOs, where researchers, so Noah and his colleagues, used UAVs to access many of the sites that haven't been censused since the 1970s. Population assessments in each region were done generally by summing the latest counts in the specific regions and propagating that uncertainty in the data by sampling from a Gaussian distribution. Now, using the newly collected data, a final global estimate was made of 3.42 million breeding pairs from 375 existing colonies. This puts this really at the low end of that original estimate of 3 to 8 million pairs. The authors were able to locate 5 new colonies and 21 additional colonies that were probably missed in previous census attempts. Sadly, though, they identified 23 of the 23 sites that had no observed breeding birds, so likely colonies that have gone extinct, or birds that are colonies where there just were no birds present. Of the colonies that had historic data available for comparison, 45% of those have likely declined, with only 18% showing some form of increase. So broadly, the picture looks quite grim for chinstraps. Now, I want to show you the figure from this paper that shows the declines spatially, because I think this is where it really strikes the message home here. And you can see across most of their distribution, certainly in the Antarctic Peninsula, you have decreases in population size on the order of 90% in a lot of cases, 80 to 90%. You do have some populations that have increased. Certainly here in South Georgia, South Sandwich Islands, you can see some population increases or at least stability. Whereas a lot of these other colonies, yeah, have literally just been hammered. So Noah, thank you for joining us, and thanks for this. Thanks for the work that you guys did on this. This is obviously a huge data gap for Antarctica. I mean, certainly for a management perspective, one of the big unknowns is chinstrap penguins. So before we get into any of the other questions, what I'm wondering if you could if one of you guys could give us some ideas of how inaccessible these colonies are. Now, I know Steve and Alex are on the call as well, and Steve and Alex Steve has been certainly going to Antarctica for a long time, and probably has some insight on this as well. But what I'd like for you to get across is how inaccessible some of these colonies are, and what makes them inaccessible.
Sure. Well, yeah, first of all, thanks for having us. And it's good to see some familiar faces. I want to say hi to Kyle in particular from the previous paper. We've had some adventures together in various places in other situations. But yeah, this paper is really very much a team effort. And so we've got Alex and Steve also on this call. They've been dealing with a lot of this kind of data for years, even before I came along. And all of us are in Heather Lynch's lab at Stony Brook, obviously. I guess as far as how remote these chin strap colonies are, I can just give an example of the field work that we did last year, just before everything shut down. Fortunately, we were able to get an opportunity to go on a Greenpeace ship. So we were basically in charge of where this ship could go, unlike most of the other tourist ships that go down there, which go where the tourists want to go. So for once we could determine which colonies we wanted to visit, and we went to some of those ones that you were mentioning earlier on Elephant Island, and we also went to another island in particular called Low Island in the South Shetland Islands, where, as far as we could tell, I did a bunch of research. Nobody had set foot on Low Island probably since the 1990s. Nobody had ever set foot on Low Island as a biologist in history to count penguins there. The previous counts had been done by a passing ship sometime in the 1980s, and there was really no other data on how many penguins were on that particular island. So I think it really drives home how remote some of these places are, and we're getting better access to satellite imagery now for some of these places, but even that has its drawbacks. You know, there's a lot of clouds in Antarctica in particular. So it's not always easy even to see them from space.
Yeah, no, that's right. Cool. And now, so obviously on your expedition, drones were playing a big role in what you guys were doing. So was it an easy task to use drones down here? Like what would you say was the biggest hurdle for using drones in some of these sites?
Yeah, we had a drone team this past field season taking drone imagery of most of the penguin colonies that we were able to visit. That was particularly useful for the larger colonies, which are harder to get a ground count by hand, just because there's so many individual penguins. I'd say one of the big challenges, just aside from weather and wind conditions, being able to fly them, is the topography of some of these sites, especially where we were on, say, Elephant Island. There's a lot of verticality involved. And when you think of an image looking down from the sky, you think of it as being two-dimensional. But that was quite difficult to put together these three-dimensional orthomosaic images of penguin colonies from drones that were being flown stepped at different altitudes to try to maintain some kind of relatively constant elevation over the ground.
Yeah, my understanding is that it's quite a process to deal with birds that are hiding in weird places and on the sides of hills and all that when you're trying to look down on them. And trying to get, and certainly and Alex and you guys are probably all aware of this, and certainly from a machine learning perspective, trying to get birds that are all, similarly oriented and at similar resolutions based on how high you're flying above them and all that has got to be a challenge. Okay, so to the data. So it looks like there's a lot of decline in populations throughout the peninsula. But there are a couple of interesting areas there. I wonder if you have any thoughts specifically on what's going on there. So Low Island, for example, you've got a couple of colonies on sort of the southwest side or the southern side, depending on which way you're oriented, that are decreasing quite substantially, 80 to 90%. And then you've got a couple of colonies on the opposite side of the island that you've shown increases in that are, on the order of 500 or so percent. Is this just a function of the number of birds in the colony? Like there was only, say, 50 birds on the other side, and now suddenly there's 250, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, for sure, especially on the West Antarctic Peninsula side where there are more smaller colonies percentage-wise. You know, with smaller numbers, you're going to see some bigger and smaller increases. The big picture is really that chin straps are spread around this region, encompassing the Antarctic Peninsula and a couple of island chains to the east, so the South Orkneys and South Sandwich Islands especially. And where we've seen the biggest decreases is the West Antarctic Peninsula, whereas farther east in the Orkneys and the Sandwich Islands, there are larger colonies that have not been as well surveyed, but from the surveys we have from those areas farther east, we think that they're probably doing better. And the West Antarctic Peninsula is being affected differently than those other areas by krill fishing and climate change, and potentially by recovering whale populations. So it's kind of hard to disentangle these different effects. But whereas chin straps are distributed in different places, they're also, their population trend is somewhat different depending on where you're looking.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think, Grant, too, there's some interesting and probably at this point poorly understood nuances that we were just made aware of. Apparently, the krill fishery, which is quite active throughout this region, surprisingly, given how remote it is, they've identified certain areas in terms of their krill take where the krill are, at least that they take, are preferred to them because they're higher in certain levels of omega-3 fatty acids. So you may have populations, even in over short distances, where the penguins are foraging in a more, you know, I don't know, I wouldn't say necessarily nutrient rich, but the krill that they're taking may have higher nutritional values than krill located even not very far away. And this is kind of some very interesting stuff that obviously is worth looking into later in terms of the variability of the prey quality, even though it seems like they all ought to be kind of fungible in terms of their, apparently there's some differences in krill quality, if you will, spatially. So that could also explain some of those minor nuanced differences.
Yeah. It's interesting, yeah, because I mean, you look at like Sierra Cove, for example, there are two colonies there showing 76 to 80% decline, and then you've got another one there that's, you know, 100% increase or something along those lines. But we know what we know, or what we've seen certainly from tracking data, is that there's not a lot of overlap between where these animals are foraging between colonies. And colonies, birds within specific colonies tend to be foraging in different areas. Which is interesting, and yeah, that's quite cool. Yeah, I hadn't realized that, but that is an interesting piece of information there. So looking at these population trends, do you have any sense of how many of these populations are on track for extinction? I mean, obviously they're all declining quite rapidly, but is there any particular region or any particular colonies that you're more concerned about reaching extinction level before, say, 2050?
Well, the chinstrap penguin, according to BirdLife, is listed as least concern at the moment. I think that's not going to change much in the near future. There are still millions and millions of these birds out there. They are the most abundant avian biomass in the region in a lot of these areas. So it's not so much a question of extinction, at least for now, as just major population changes happening in this species that is a major part of the ecosystem that it lives in. And when you see those kinds of changes, it probably is indicative of some kind of underlying change in the greater ecosystem that it's inhabiting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At the scale of individual colonies as well, you know, given that we haven't disentangled all the potential drivers of decline, we certainly can say is smaller colonies are more at risk for just stochastic, effects, right? And that's certainly the case in a place like Antarctica, which, climate change aside, already has an extraordinarily dynamic, climate. So you can have radically different years, one year to the next in a way that's less the case in more temperate climates, which, for example, one of the spots we surveyed on Elephant Island this last year, we looked at aerial imagery from the 1950s and Landsat from 70s and 80s and the surveys that were in the 70s. And in the mid 1950s, one of these colonies had a glacier on top of it. There were no penguins there. By the time it was surveyed in the 70s, that glacier had retreated. Penguins had moved in, but then Landsat shows us that glacier had moved back out and covered part of the colony again. So, there are already these things that are sort of baked into the system that these penguins have to deal with. When you add other stressors on top in a smaller colony, the risk just goes up.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the other response to that, Grant, would be these are fairly long-lived animals. So we're talking about a fairly long lag time with high site fidelity, breeding site fidelity. So, we may not, we're kind of looking at trends that the impacts may have occurred a decade or more ago. So kind of difficult to extrapolate into the future into the risk of any individual colony, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. You're looking at generational effects here that are difficult to pick up when you're when there's so many confounding factors and they're changing so rapidly. David, do you have any questions?
Yes. Well, quick ones. But first of all, I'd like to stress how much I enjoyed reading the discussion of the paper and the overall framework. I felt it was really not just about counting penguins and flagging population trends. I really enjoyed the whole of the context and the story about former competition with whales and climate change and fisheries, and it gave the whole complexity. So I really recommend to everyone, please read the discussion and the whole of the paper. I found it really interesting. And we talked briefly about fisheries already. As you know, I'm slightly obsessed about seabird fishery competition, and so I'm wondering what the nation is actually doing the krill fishery in the area of interest where there could be competition with the penguins.
Yeah, maybe Steve or Alex can chime in on this. As far as I'm aware, there has already been a voluntary zone where the krill fishers are not going near certain penguin colonies during the summer months to avoid overlap. There are also potential plans for creating marine protected areas in this region that would help benefit penguins. But I don't know, Steve or Alex, do you have any more specifics?
I can help from the.
Yeah, Javier is on, and actually Javier would probably have a good perspective on this.
Good day, everyone. First, my name is Javier Arata. I'm former Seabird ecologist working in albatrosses. But recently now I'm working for ARC, which is the Association for Responsible Krill Harvesting Company. So I'm working for the krill guys. Trying to make them to do the right thing, but just for you to know. So first I wanted to thank Strycker and all the group because of not just this paper, but few papers that have been released in the recent time with an update of the chinstrap, adelis, gentus, and all the penguins in this area has been provided a great perspective. And please upload the papers to ResearchGate or something similar, because not everybody has access to the papers in the official ways. Regarding the krill fishery, well, you know that the krill fishery has a peak in the 90s and was really high, about 500,000 tons, and then decreased after the years, the Soviet Union collapsed and there was increase with Japanese, but not too much. But since 2005 approximately, with the new technology developed by Norway, the catches have been increased a lot. Norway is still catching about 40 to 50% of the total catch right now. That is about 200,000 tons of krill, just the Norwegian. And then you have the Chinese catching also a lot now. And then you have a few, the Ukraine, Chile, and Korea. In total, about 400,000. And in the Antarctic Peninsula, they are fishing right now the quota, which is 155,000, which the argument right now is how much is that? Is it low or high catch? And depends a lot on the year. Sometimes, some year you have a lot of krill, and 155,000 tons maybe is not too much. But some years you have a really low krill biomass. And maybe then the quota could be a bit too much. And that's the discussion right now happening in Camelot.
And along this discussion, one argument I heard is that it's better to have, so to say, an official, well-established and managed krill fishery in this area than a sort of trying to reduce fishing activities and then the spread of more or less illegal, uncontrolled activities. What do you think about that?
Well, in the long term, it's better to have a regulated fishery than just to have an area that nobody goes. That happened with the toothfish fishery, at least, and it seems to work. For the moment, it doesn't look that there's going to be any illegal krill fishery activity because there is a quota that they are not using it, and the market is still in development. It's not in toothfish. You get just one vessel, illegal vessel, that you catch from Namibia or any other place, an old rusty vessel you send south, and in one trip can make millions. In the krill fishery, you need a lot of investment to process the krill properly, and you have to have the market path to actually make the profit, because the fish meal itself is not very attractive. You have to have a bit more of a investment to produce to refine the oil of the krill, which is the high market.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for that. Yeah.
May I ask something now about the penguins?
Yeah, please ask away.
You know, I heard Noah mention that you are comparing your census now that you are done with satellites, with drones, and actually with scientists on the field, comparing with some census in the 70s that were done in some cases just from the vessels. So when you do this analysis, increase and decrease, how do you put in the error or the potential error in the estimates in the 70s, which I guess could be much larger than today? I have this experience in the past with albatrosses. In this case, in Chile, the albatross numbers increases by 3 or 4 times, just because the way that the colonies are in Chile, you cannot census properly from the vessel, so the numbers were underestimated in the 80s. But what happened when you compare today's data with 70s, early 80s data?
Sure. Yeah, uncertainty is a big part of trying to estimate these populations and how they've changed, of course. And there's uncertainty in each estimate on its own, and then there's uncertainty over time as populations change and you don't have a newer estimate to update it. So we've tried to capture both of those types of uncertainty by assigning levels to each of these estimates in our database. So the highest level of uncertainty is within 5%. That's a nest count or a chick count within 5%. And then they just go down from there. And we've binned it into 5 different levels of uncertainty. So we've done our best to capture all of that in our models.
Yeah, well, 5% is not too much compared with others. You know, I was reading your paper, and I got confused in one section only that says if you compare the colony by colony changes over time, you have 40% of colonies that declined and 16% that have increased. But then you said this picture changes when assessing total population rather than the number of colonies. For example, 50% of the total population are in colonies that have declined, and 25% in colonies that have increased. So if you look just at the total numbers, is there more how is the number? Has increased a little bit, or has it still decreasing a lot?
Yeah, that's a good point to make, actually, because there are more individual colonies in the Antarctic Peninsula area, but those colonies are smaller and better surveyed. So that seems to be where they're declining the most. However, as I mentioned earlier, farther east in the South Sandwich Islands, there are many fewer, much larger colonies that have not been well surveyed. And that's where a lot of the uncertainty in the total number, global population estimate comes from. And so if you look at the confidence interval for the South Sandwich Islands, it's like 970,000 to 1.8 million pairs or something like that. And so on the high end, that could potentially even wipe out a lot of the declines in the western part of their population. But we don't have a very firm grasp of that because it just hasn't been surveyed that well.
Okay. Yeah. What you were saying before. So in the east, they seem to be better on the Western Antarctic Peninsula. So both the colonies and the total number has declined.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Javier. Marianna, do you have any questions, or do we have any other questions from the audience while we're here?
I'll just ask one last question. So you say that this is an ongoing project. So what is next?
Yeah, what's next? We have more field work planned for future seasons and keep going down, keep surveying and monitoring and trying to get especially to the colonies that have not been visited before, potentially on things like private yachts, and who knows what other kinds of opportunities will come up in the future. But yeah, as with many long-term Seabird projects, it's very much an ongoing surveying and monitoring and constantly learning a little bit of new information each field season kind of project.
Gemma turned on her camera. She looks like she's got a question. Hi, Gemma.
Yeah. Hey, nice to see you guys. So specifically about the South Sandwich Islands, Tom and I spent a long time trying to fly drones off a small yacht going up and down in big swell this year. Do we still need to try and do that, or can Landsat kind of fill the gaps there, do you think?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question? Is it comparing drones versus Landsat?
Do we need to get drones over those colonies regularly still, or do you think we can fill that gap with Landsat now?
Yeah, maybe Alex in particular can chime in. I would think that the accuracy for drone surveys is still much higher than what you can get from satellite images. But Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, Alex is
oh, did he jump off?
Yeah,
sorry. Yeah, he's gone.
Yeah, the thing is, when you compare, when you look at drone images up close, you can see so much more resolution than you can get from satellite imagery, and that makes a big difference in being able to define and count, a nest versus just some penguin wandering on its own, or a rock, or who knows what else is happening.
But so was it really challenging to combine all these different type of data streams?
Yeah, for sure. We had old counts that were probably very inaccurate and who knows how accurate. And we had new counts that were highly accurate, and drones and satellite imagery and on the ground people in various conditions. And, assigning uncertainties to all of these counts and putting them all together was an interesting task for sure. But I think it's turned out fairly well, actually.
Yeah, it was very good to get that population estimate finally trimmed down to something a little bit more reasonable than 3 to 8 million breeding pairs.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe maybe a last quick one for detail while you're on. So most of the colonies are on the Antarctic Peninsula and around, and then in the South Atlantic there's one isolated site, and that's probably Bouvet Island. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a tiny colony on Bouvet.
Yeah, and then on the other side of the Ross Sea, there's also one site. Where is it?
Yeah, that's the Balleny Islands. Again, a very, very small number of chin straps out there.
Okay, wow, exciting. And for that place, you don't have. Do you have an idea about population trends, because it's in a completely different system if you compare to the Antarctic Peninsula?
Yeah, we had a couple accounts there. I honestly can't really remember. The Balleny Islands, we're talking on the order of like tens of penguins. So in the grand scheme, it's not much.
Yeah.
Okay. No, it's a really interesting study, because I had this perception of chin straps, being linked to a fairly, let's say, homogeneous marine environment, and clearly now in the discussion, I understood that it's actually very varied, and from a conservation perspective, it adds to the redundancy, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's fascinating to compare the three pygocelids, the chin straps, the adeles, and the gentoos, and how their populations are responding differently to similar conditions where they overlap, and maybe different conditions in seasons where they don't overlap. We think of Antarctica as being such a simplified system, but when you get down to it, it just gets more and more complex and hard to understand.
Well, I guess the Arctic is this, to the power of something.
That's right. Oh, cool. Thanks for that discussion. Noah, Steve, thanks for joining us. That's a fantastic paper, and really excited to see that out there. And of course, nice to see your faces, fellow penguin counters. And Gemma, nice to see you too, by the way. And thanks for the questions. All right, I'm going to stop recording now.